Diane Sare, a LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate. And this is the New York Symposium with Diane Sare. And I think we have a very urgently needed topic this evening. And I will be joined by an extensive panel of people who have been in a political battle for some time and who are very familiar with the issues that we're presenting. In a sense, I feel like what we've been experiencing is kind of a sleight of hand magic trick where everyone's looking in one direction, which is the question of vote fraud, voter irregularity. And I'm not saying that there's not also a great deal of substance on these questions, but while people are concerned about even having their vote counted, there's been another whole operation to really make that question irrelevant by restricting who has access to the ballot. And as a LaRouche organizer over 32 years, we've certainly I've experienced various fights and brawls when he ran for president and so on, and states have different laws. New York was always one of the most difficult states, requiring 15,000 ballot signatures. He was running at the time in the Democratic Party primaries. We did it successfully at least twice, unsuccessfully once. That was considered one of the most onerous states. And then I learned that this now has been changed. If you were not with the Democratic or Republican Party and running in a statewide race, you now need, according to something that was slipped into the budget by the former Governor Cuomo, 45,000 valid signatures. And also the Libertarian Party and Green Party lost their ballot status because the percentage of votes or votes needed to remain on the ballot was arbitrarily increased. So this looks like a real attempt to silence any discussion or debate and to disenfranchise the voters, because they're not going to have, it's not only that you won't get to hear from candidates, which is already a problem that many of us have experienced by the very controlled news media, but you will not only not hear from them, they will not be on the ballot. So this is obviously of major concern, and I would like people to speak about it. Now, it is my view that the reason for this kind of really totalitarian dictatorial approach at this moment is because the financial system is in its death agony. As people are aware, and this has been going on actually for some time since Nixon decoupled the dollar from the gold reserve system, but particularly since 2008, the crash, we have been doing nothing but quantitative easing, printing money. We did not increase production. We did not increase our infrastructure. We now are at a kind of a hyperinflationary moment. The price of food has increased 32% in the last year. The price of cotton has increased 47% in the last year. We have artificial shortages being created of gas, coal, et cetera, and the prices are going through the roof. And this, to me, is indicative of the end of a system. And in such a moment, the powers that be, the financial powers that are hanging by a thread or who want to be left standing when everything else collapses, certainly don't want other voices putting forward an alternative program, particularly the kind of things that Lyndon LaRouche was famous for saying, like putting the whole system through bankruptcy, as Franklin Roosevelt did, and getting the powerful nations, Russia, China, India, the US, together to go back to some kind of a either gold reserve or a basket of commodities, but a stable system, no floating exchange rate, and a situation where people are allowed to develop. You see this in all different ways, and I obviously have much more to say about it. There is a certain cruelty to this system. If you look at what's happening right now in Afghanistan, where we left, which is a good thing, whatever you think about the manner of it, But then the Treasury has ordered frozen the $9.2 billion of the Afghanistan Central Bank. Now 80% of their health system is dysfunctional, and 1 million children under 5 are on the brink of starvation. And our State Department says we will not release their money because of women's rights or something. If that policy is not changed, that is the policy that will be visited upon people in the United States, and it already is. And that is another thing that is not to be discussed, not to be debated, and it won't be debated, certainly among the mainstream Democratic and Republican parties. So I'm going to stop there. Let me just tell you who is here with me, and let me also say that participation in this program does not constitute an endorsement of my campaign for U.S. Senate, just as I will not necessarily endorse the views or parties that are represented here, but that all of us think it is urgent that the American people have a right to a fair debate, to hear disagreements and agreements, and to make informed decisions as opposed to decisions dictated to them by the press or the financial establishment. So first of all, we will have Richard Winger, who is a political analyst who's been in the fight for minor party ballot access and access in elections for a long time, and is the founder of Ballot Access News. Rich Purtell, who is the political director for the Libertarian Party, was the political director for the Libertarian Party of New York from 2018 to 2019. He's currently the chair of the Libertarian Party Legislative Affairs Subcommittee. Professor Anthony Gronowicz, who is formerly a Green Party candidate for mayor of New York in 2005 and 2013, a professor and author of several books. Most recently, he's written a book called The Last Western Empire, A History of U.S. Foreign Policy. Dion Powell from the Bronx 79th Assembly District County Committeeman, and a political consultant without whom we would not all be here. And Dennis Speed, my colleague, who is the moderator of the LaRouche Manhattan Project. So I'm going to now turn it over to Mr. Winger. And you're muted. Richard, there you go.
Hi, I think I'm not muted now. Okay. Well, what New York State Legislature has done in the last 2 years is shocking, and it's gotten very little publicity. In early 2019, they moved the petition deadline for independent candidates and the nominees of unqualified parties from August to May. Now, think about that for a second. The Republican Party was founded on July 6, 1854. And they did that because they were shocked that Congress had just passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which transferred Kansas and Nebraska territories from free territory to whatever the people living there wanted. So they couldn't have formed the party any earlier because it was formed in response to that shocking event. Now, if we had election laws like New York has today back then, a party formed on July 6th would not have been able to get on the ballot. And New York now has the third earliest petition deadline in the nation, when the easier and the later method for getting on the ballot for president is compared. In fact, there are 6 states where even June has been declared unconstitutionally early. And yet, the New York Times never even mentioned this. Then in April 2020, they made it worse. They changed the number of signatures for statewide independents and the nominees of unqualified parties from 15,000 to 45,000. Now, to put that into context, it used to be 20,000 until 1992. And in 1992, the legislature was so afraid that Ross Perot would not get on the ballot in New York, and New York would be very embarrassed if that happened because it would look awful. They lowered it to 15,000. So they had a realistic fear that even 20,000 was too hard, and they lowered it to 15,000. And now all of a sudden it shoots up to 45,000. And they changed the definition of a qualified party to a group that got 2% for president and 2% for governor. You have to do both. You have to meet that test every 2 years. That made New York one of only 3 states that a party can't stay on the ballot unless it performs well for president. And you might think, oh, 2% for president, that doesn't sound so hard. Well, in the last 70 years, there's been only 4 parties other than the Democratic and Republican parties that managed to get 2% in a presidential election. It's very tough in our society for a minor party to do well in the presidential election. That doesn't mean they can't elect people. And so what are the excuses for these changes? Well, first they say the ballot's messy and it'll be simpler with fewer candidates on it. Well, it's true. The New York ballot is messy. It's very ugly. I collect ballots. And New York is one of only 5 states that hasn't gone to the much clearer, more beautiful office group ballot. In an office group ballot, the ballot lists an office, then it lists the people who are running for that office underneath. And you can take in easily with your eye who's running and pick one. And then you go on to the next office. But New York insists on having this obsolete office party column ballot, which makes it very hard for voters to even find some people. The other states with such bad ballots are New Hampshire, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Delaware. And then they say, oh, well, we had to make it harder to be a qualified party because we're putting in public funding for state office, and we don't want to give money to just anybody. And that's totally, totally, totally phony, because New York is in the Second Circuit, and the Second Circuit ruled 10 years ago in a Green Party case, Green Party of Connecticut versus Garfield, that if states want to have public funding and just include the major parties and not the minor parties, that's constitutional. It was a terrible decision, but it's there. The Supreme Court wouldn't review it. So given that that is the state of the law, it's completely phony for any New York legislator to say we have to save money by getting rid of these parties, because it's not true. And then the third excuse is there'll be too many people on the ballot without these changes. But the truth is, in all New York State history, there's never been a general election office with more than 9 candidates on the ballot for an office for which is only a single winner. So I don't know if I've bumped up against my 10 minutes or not. So maybe I should shut up and let somebody else talk.
Great. Well, I think people will have more questions and you'll have more to say. Thank you very much. Maybe we'll go to Rich Purtell of the Libertarian Party.
Thank you, Diane. And thank you, Mr. Winger, for all your excellent points about the challenges of ballot access in New York. Just to add a couple of points, I agree with the compliance to the MOVE Act, to what is it, the Military and Overseas Voters Empowerment Act, to allow for better access to the elections for people that are more distant from the United States during the the election period. So the primary was moved from September to June, but there's no reason why you cannot have the independent petitioning period in summer. And in particular, upstate New York, we don't have the population density like they have in New York City and the 5 boroughs in Long Island. I ran for state senate myself in 2015 and 2016, and the limit for independent bodies to get on the ballot is 3,000. It was 3,000 signatures. I don't think that's changed, actually. Well, if you take 3,000 signatures times 62 Senate district in New York, to get a candidate on in every Senate district would take 188,000 signatures. So you can see that even for a smaller district race like that, it's really difficult. And I achieved 850 signatures, but it got challenged in 2015, and I got to like 1,400 in 2016. I didn't even submit because I knew I was still short. But so 1,400 times 62 would be what, 84,000. So you can see, you know, I worked my butt off to get that kind of count in one little Senate district. But so back to the point about the primary. You know, the primary can stay in June, but let petitioning go on all summer and let the candidates then go to, you know, fairs, public events where there's lots of people, because you got, you know, if you're going door knocking at 10 signatures per hour, even if you have a lot of volunteers, it just thousands of, you know, it'd be literally thousands of hours of time, man hours to get all those signatures. But if you can get out to a county fair, parade or something like that, you can get 30, 40, 50 signatures an hour. I've done events. I did the Speedy Fest in Binghamton in 2016. I was on the sidewalk at 5 a.m. Up until late in the afternoon, and I got, you know, hundreds of signatures in that period of time. So yeah, I just want to add to Richard's point. And the other comment I'd make is about fusion. You know, another reason our ballots are so complicated is because this process of being able to fuse in any election where candidates could be on multiple lines, and the way the ballot is structured, as Richard said, you're going to tend to pick the candidate at the first line. You see, the voter will typically pick the candidate on the first line they see. So maybe they're a Libertarian member, but if they see a candidate who's also Republican or Democrat or whatever, that major party line's higher on the ballot, the voter's going to tend to check the box there, and then the 2% qualification that the minor party is trying to get is going to be hindered by that. So the ballot structure makes that qualification process more difficult if there's cross endorsement, aka fusion. So excellent points made by Mr. Ringer, and I just wanted to add, I guess, those couple of comments is that let's get petitioning back to summer for the independents, and let's just, and let it last for more than 6 weeks. Let's go like a 12-week period or something, so we can have lots of time to get all those signatures. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn now to Professor Gronowicz.
Well, I've run numerous times in New York City. I guess the first time was for state assembly when Ralph Nader ran the first time in '96. And I ran, as was pointed out, for mayor in 2005 and 13. And I ran actually for Congress in AOC seat on the Green New Deal in 2012. Of course, she ran in 16 and won with DSA support. And it's extremely onerous. What happened to the 50,000 votes for governor in the last election, which automatically gets you on the ballot? That's my question for Richard Winger. Does that exist anymore?
Shall I just talk here? Should I go ahead and?
Yeah.
Okay, well,
Yes, go ahead.
when they raised the number of signatures for statewide petitions, at the same time, they changed the definition of a party from a group that got 50,000 votes for governor, which you just said, to 2% for president and governor. So that really it's going to be about 150,000 votes now.
All right.
It was the same bill.
Well, listen, I agree I agree completely with Diane's analysis of what's happened in the past 50 or 60 years that's compelling the two parties to shut out independent or third parties. It's very tough, obviously. And the fix is in. I mean, you look at de Blasio. I ran in the race with de Blasio in 13, and he, of course, raised more money. There were 14 candidates running for mayor in 13, and he raised more money than all the candidates put together. Not only that, I mean, he was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager in the year 2000 when she ran for Senate. So these people are in there early and they are chosen. And then we have Bloomberg, the richest mayor in history, all history, running for mayor. And the first time around, he just barely made it. Second time around, he spent, I don't know, each time he spent more money than any candidate in history for mayor. And the third time that he ran, which would be 2009, his vote total was less for mayor than any winning candidate since before women got the right to vote in New York, which was sometime during the First World War. So, I mean, the system is bought and paid for. It's a plutocracy. And as you pointed out, Diane, the financial establishment really wasn't never a democracy. It's not in the Constitution. It's a republic, but that doesn't limit. And after Citizens United, and you can spend as much money as you want. And, you know, I came to people and said, well, people say, I don't know you, but I know this guy. And they showed me a glossy leaflet of Bloomberg, because he's bombarding all people's mailboxes with this. So it really is not going to end nicely in this country. We've already seen this. They're not the politicians are basically intermediaries between the financial institutions and the people. And it's, as you saw with the cell phone visuals, first with Eric Garner, which was only 60,000 people marching, and then with George Floyd, which is millions of people marching. And it's a Democratic, Floyd was killed in a Democratic city run by a Democratic, in a state run by a Democratic governor. So, you know, there's no difference. As unfortunately, Henry Wallace was the one who coined it back in '68, and he said there's not a dime's worth of difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. And certainly in the 20th century, the Democrats brought us into the 4 wars that cost the most American lives: 1 and 2, Korea, and Vietnam. So the fix has always been in. But Diane's analysis of why it's happening now, I couldn't agree more with. She's absolutely right, what's gone on. So I hope you all heard what she said at the beginning of her presentation. So I really don't want to take up more time. I was just notified I should speak on behalf, and I had a family crisis. My sister had major surgery today, and going in, and was all very, plus I'm teaching and writing, and I said, I do it because I have to do it, because I have to be here with the rest of you and say that we need concerted action on ballot access, which is, it's never been worse.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I hope as we get talking, I know both you and Richard know a lot also about the history. And I think for people who are younger, there are many people who don't have any idea that things were ever different, that we ever had a debate that wasn't like a game show where you hit the button and the lights flash and you have 30 seconds to say something, as opposed to an actual thought. So I'm going to go to Dion Powell now to tell us why he's interested in this matter.
Thank you for having me, Diane. I really appreciate you. I'm Dion Powell. I'm just going to give you a little background about organizations I'm a part of or started. I helped start actually the Bronx Libertarian Party. That's how I got involved with Larry Sharp 2018. We got the party line on the ballot. I'm also the founder of the New York Free Thinking Democrats in New York State and South Bronx, which is on Facebook. And also I ran for New York State Assembly last year as well. So I know what it's like to be in the fight. An interesting factoid about what's going on here with the changes. Frank McKay of the New York State Independence Party, actually, I associated with to try to get their line. The logic for them to phase out that party line, in case you know, is because the name was too confusing between independence and independent. So people who want to be independent will often register with the Independence Party, giving them ballot access. Now that was ridiculous if you can stay about that. As for the Libertarian Party, nationally, a lot of the two prime parties don't like them because they're often called election spoilers because they give the people a lot of options in terms of voting. Now, another factoid is that Jerry Kassar, who's the chair of the New York State Conservative Party, which I associate with as well, said something to me very interesting. He said, Dion, you know, if these third parties, the Greens, the Libertarians, and so on, were to sign on to our lawsuit, maybe we could have taken this fight a little further and we all went together. Because as you know, the Conservative Party actually still has ballot access because of that. But this year and going forward, they're being targeted as well. And another factoid is that the Workers' Family Party was almost losing their ballot access. And with their progressive issues, they actually had to court King Cuomo in order to be on their ballot in order to get access. So there's a lot of hypocrisy across the board. But I want to end by saying this. One of the people that actually was a governor, Jesse Bonaventura, you know, as you may know from Wrestling Claim, says something in his documentary that was very interesting in his lecture. He said, you know what, in the general election, we should remove all political parties from the ballot. That way the voter would have to be more informed and search who the candidates were. So if you imagine a general election, if you remove all those political party titles and you just had names there, how different the outcome could be. But thank you once again, Diane, for having me on the show.
You're welcome. So I'm going to turn now to Dennis Speed and get his thoughts. And I already have a bunch of questions myself, aside from what anyone else has. Go ahead, Dennis.
All right, I think I have mainly questions for various people. And I think that those questions will reveal a few things. And I'll just pose one question to everyone to think about. This is partially rhetorical, but partially it's not. And I think we should ask this question. Let's assume, or maybe everybody doesn't know about the famous scholar and intellectual Helen Keller, who was deaf and dumb and blind. She was one of the more celebrated intellectuals of the 20th century. Should Helen Keller be allowed access to run for office in New York State? Suppose you had somebody like that. Suppose you had someone who, like she did, despite those infirmities, went to Harvard, or rather Radcliffe, and graduated from there, and was celebrated around the world for her autobiography and for the work she had done. Suppose she wanted, by the way, she was a socialist by political affiliation. So suppose she wanted to run in New York State and was faced with the kind of challenges to get on the ballot that Rich Purtell talked about, being out all day, you know, going out at 5 o'clock in the morning and doing his petitions and getting hundreds of signatures, but that he's physically capable of doing that. It's worth thinking about that. I have a couple of questions that I want to ask, and I'm coming to Richard Winger first. Richard, how long have you been involved in this ballot access battle?
1965.
And what year were you born?
1943.
So from the age of 22, you've been involved in this. What caused you to get involved?
I was fascinated by small political parties. In the early 60s, the only small political parties that were actually running candidates were very obscure. It was the Socialist Workers' Party, the Socialist Labor Party, and the Prohibition Party. And nationwide, that was it. And I thought, these people never get any publicity. They have no prestige. But I was collecting election returns, and I saw that in some elections, they got a lot of votes. So I wanted to be a political scientist and analyze who votes for these parties. But in my own state, they were not on the ballot because the ballot access law of California was so horrible. California's always had bad ballot access. So I thought, well, that's funny. What's wrong with my state? Then I looked into the ballot access laws, and I found out how bad California was. So I thought, well, maybe I can do something about it. And I wrote a bill to make it easier. And I took it to my state legislators. And I just worked my head off for that bill. and it might have passed, except that unfortunately it was coming up for a vote in the spring of 1967. And just then the word got out that George Wallace was going to run for president outside the major parties. So the Republicans were horrified at that. They thought it would ruin Richard Nixon's chances, so they caucused against my bill. So that was the beginning.
And so if you're 22 years old in 1965, you were probably aware of the battle that went on at the Atlantic City Convention in 1964 involving something called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party.
Right, Fannie Lou Hamer, yeah.
Yeah, Fannie Lou Hamer, right. And you might want to say something here because, of course, this was an independent political party formation that was required in Mississippi because the Mississippi Democratic Party, which was a segregationist party, would not recognize the duly registered and complying Democratic Party voters who were Black and otherwise in opposition to segregation. Is that correct?
Right. The Voting Rights Act hadn't passed yet. That was in 1965. So in the Deep South, African Americans mostly couldn't register to vote. They just absolutely couldn't. So the fight in Atlantic City, New Jersey, was to get the Democratic Party to do something about it. And the Mississippi Democratic Party was completely controlled by segregationists. So they got a very tiny little concession from the National Democratic Party. The National Democratic Party seated 2 representatives of Fannie Lou Hamer's group. But
right. I have other questions for you, but I'm going to go for a minute to Mr. Gronowicz.
Okay.
We'll come back to you. Mr. Gronowicz, you are an author, correct?
Yes.
Could you just, because I don't think people would have heard any of this before we came on, could you say something about what kind of books you write and some of the things you've researched?
Well, I did a book on race and class politics in New York City before the Civil War. And I looked at the Democratic Party in 1844 and 1884. And I discovered, doing a quantitative analysis of the party personnel, turned out to be 2,391 guys, white guys, in 44, and exactly 3,084. It just worked out that way. So 5,391. And I did an analysis, quantitative analysis of their ethnicity, their position in the party, and where they were from. And it was very complex. It was a very labor-intensive effort on my part. But I said, I'm going to do something worthwhile. And actually 44 and 84 provided the pylons for the narrative political bridge that I constructed for the 19th century. And what I discovered in 44 was that the party was more Irish and more working class than it was in 84. And where was the working class, which was only 2% in 84, were actually party personnel. I'm not talking about voters, because in the absence of a technological media, all you had was newspapers, and every newspaper was a partisan paper, especially in the 1840s. And you could figure out where they stood, but they were pretty scrupulous in publishing news that would get to people so that they could attend the various gatherings. So I put it together, and I came up with something which is precisely the opposite of what conventional political wisdom says about the 19th century Democratic Party. It was more Irish in the 40s. Where were the workers? They were in unions in the 1880s, where they languished and died ever since as an independent force within the party system.
I just like to ask you another question to follow, and I know other people here are also going to have questions. So, but just could you just name some of the other books you've written? I'm going to try to make a point after you do that about something.
Well, I just finished this, and this took a long time. I had to cut it down. It was 415,000 words. Now it's 128,000 words. Last Western Empire, A History of U.S. Foreign Policy. And basically, what I uncovered is that, well, it should be obvious that both parties supported all the wars of the 20th century. And even the earlier war, the Spanish-American War, which was attacked by Mark Twain and William James and Samuel Gompers and Jane Addams through the Anti-Imperialist League, because it was U.S. imperialism after the frontier filled out in the 19th century and closed in 1893. The U.S. immediately gets involved in a two-ocean war, namely, well, the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific, and seizes those territories, those countries, those people. And they did it on racist grounds, because at that point in time, you had the Redeemer governments. Reconstruction had collapsed in the South because the federal troops were removed. And Blacks were ethnically cleansed from the South, where they went to the cities in the North. So I'm still feeling, I'm doing one just on the domestic repercussions of the foreign policy, because foreign policy is actually a reflection of the domestic needs and the domestic needs of the Anglo-American corporate power structure.
And I just want to reflect, you can't get on the ballot, correct? I mean, you've tried on various different occasions to meet the ballot access requirements and have been able to do so. Is that correct?
Well, not recently, not recently. 13, I had some help from my friends, a little help from my friends. I got on and I was the candidate, and I came in fourth out of 14, but there's a naturally green constituency. I got most signatures in front of the Park Slope Food Co-op in 05 and in 13. That was real easy. So.
And I have a final question for Mr. Purtell. Mr. Purtell, you talked about what you did to get the signatures, right?
Right.
And but you were making a bigger point, which is, wait a minute, if you take these requirements and extrapolate them over, 62 plus districts, this is something gets you like 180,000 signatures. And if I understood you correctly, your main point was this is insurmountable. This is just something that it's too onerous for people to be able to do.
Yeah, I just was pointing out that the statewide ballot access is hard, and then to do it by assembly district or state senate district is even harder proportionally. So
right, and not only that, but the period of time even to collect these signatures has been essentially moved in such a way that people that were trying to start an independent force that decided to respond to a particular national crisis and was born coming out of that crisis would find it almost impossible to get ballot access. Is that right?
Yeah, and maybe I didn't clearly explain. I made the upstate New York point, and that summer petitioning, you've got the county fairs, and you've got longer days and weather in your favor too. I mean, an April-May petition period, it gets dark earlier. You're not going to have county fairs. You're not going to have parades. It's still late winter. So I think a summer petitioning period now. So they've made it doubly worse by making the petition period in April, May instead of July, August. To me, that's just as bad, if not worse, than increasing the signatures. I think that getting the petitioning period back to summer would be just as helpful as lowering the number.
But let me ask you a question. Why are you saying that? I just want you to be clear so people understand, because if people have never done it, they don't know why you're saying that.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I've collected thousands of signatures personally, so I've seen the numbers, how it works out. Typically, in a suburban area with single family homes, knocking on doors, first of all, as you say, you have to be physically fit enough to walk for miles and miles in a day to do it, and you're going to get about 10 signatures per hour. Now, to your point about Helen Keller, let's say if I was in a wheelchair at the Speedy Fest, where I got lots of signatures in 2016. That, someone who's disabled could do that pretty well. They wouldn't have to walk. They could sit. Lots of people will be walking by them on a sidewalk. They could get many more signatures per hour as a disabled person than I could get walking door to door and knocking on doors. So, but again, weather has to be in your favor. Daylight has to be in your favor. You have to have these types of events. So yeah, getting back to summer petitioning, in my opinion, is just as important as getting the numbers back down.
But what you just said, of course, indicates that external factors having nothing to do with your support could in fact hinder the number of signatures that you got, right?
Correct.
Okay, great. So this is what I just wanted to establish. I think that's clear. Diane, we can do whatever you want to do, open it up for other people. But I just wanted to pose some of these things so people would hear and understand what's really happened here, what's happened to the country and what's happened in New York, which is that you have various forms in which this control is being exerted, which have nothing to do with whether people will prefer a particular candidate or not. And this is a known factor among those that have worked in this field for decades. Some of us go back that far. I happen to go back to 1972 in this. So for 50 years, I've been involved in it. And I know therefore a bit more than others might. So just wanted to establish some of that.
Great. Well, I have one question that came in on YouTube, which I think Richard Winger may be the best to answer, which is whether or not there's an appeal going on to Judge Kotel's decision before the Second Circuit and what the status of that is.
Yes, I can answer that.
Okay.
In a typical constitutional case where the plaintiffs are challenging the constitutionality of a law, there's two parts of the case, especially if it's an election law case and there's a big rush. First, the plaintiffs ask for injunctive relief. And that means, please give us some relief right now, even before the trial. And Judge Kettle, I'm not sure how to say his name, has already denied injunctive relief to all the parties. And boy, there's 4 parties challenging this new law: the SAM Party, the Working Families Party, and a case filed jointly by the Libertarian and Green parties. So he's denied injunctive relief. He hasn't yet denied declaratory relief. And the Libertarian and Green Party case is now in the Second Circuit asking for injunctive relief. Well, the SAM Party already went to the Second Circuit and was denied injunctive relief. I'm afraid this is confusing. I'm sorry, but it's not over. That's the main point. And by the way, I'd like to correct them. Something I said when I said there had never been a general election race in New York State with more than 9 candidates on the ballot. I should have clarified. I was talking about statewide races. The bad bill did not change the number of signatures for district office and city office. So I was only talking about statewide.
Great. So I personally have a lot of questions, and I think everybody may have views of this. I mean, one, we know, and we were discussing earlier, George Washington himself opposed the party system. LaRouche actually on his 90th birthday said the party, and with his New Hampshire accent, party system was over. And I think, frankly, you saw this with the 2016 election of Donald Trump, who was not supported certainly by the Bush wing of the Republican Party. And people thought Hillary had the whole thing locked up. And I think it was sort of a shock or an indication of a revolt against the so-called party system or party system. But I would like to know, one, how we should correct this. On the petitioning, it seems to me, and anyone who hasn't done it, I mean, there are judges saying, oh, 15,000 signatures, that's not onerous. Well, obviously, they've never tried. They have never been in the streets doing this to know what they're talking about. It would seem to me what would be fair is some nominal thing that indicates you're willing to get out there and talk to people, like a few hundred signatures or something like that, just indicating a certain level of commitment. I know in some states you can pay to get on the ballot and not even petition. And then how do we handle this system? We have primaries. We've talked about, there are open primaries. There's now ranked choice voting. I'm just curious to know your thoughts, people's thoughts. I have certain opinions about these things, but I would like to know what others think, how this should be handled, and what is the remedy to this mess.
Anybody in particular want to take that up?
Well, I can respond briefly. I'm a big fan of proportional representation. That's how we got rent control and rent stabilization back in the 1940s. And of course, that went out the window. The rents have gone up, and we're facing a housing crisis in this city that we never have had in the history of the city. And they keep kicking the can down the road. So many, we're talking 200,000 households that are threatened with eviction and 8 million nationally. So we have a, this dovetails or reflects exactly what Diane's analysis was about what went on in the country over the last 50 years economically.
Can I just ask, when you say proportional representation, what do you mean? How does that work?
Well, a party puts up a candidate, and it's in a city, right? And this was this city, New York City, where we got this. And whatever percentage the party gets, they get a proportional representation in the, maybe it was 39 council people back then. Today it's 51. So you rank, the parties divvy up the council seats. So you have a fair representation in the council of actually what people think, rather than a winner take all system, which is, that's how Trump got in.
Mm-hmm. Richard?
I completely agree with Anthony. And every time somebody compiles an objective list of the 10 best countries in the world, not just based on people's emotions, but objective criteria, statistical stuff, invariably at least 9 of them use proportional representation. If only the United States would look at the whole world and see the best governed countries use proportional representation, we could get it here. But unfortunately, Americans have a bad habit of not looking at the best work done in other countries.
Others?
I'd like to just interject that proportional representation does present problems for the smaller rural areas. Like my town board only has 4 people on it. So it's hard to get proportional representation if you have 5 or 6 parties in a group of only 4 people. So, and that will be true of many of the rural areas upstate.
What about having open primaries that are not by party? Richard, yeah, go ahead.
There's one populous country in the world that has all nonpartisan elections for its national legislature. That's Iran. Iran is one of the worst governed countries in the world. I'm a strong believer in political parties. Political parties are supposed to be organizations of like-minded people who come together to work for their goals. And any system that is hostile to political parties invariably means things are going to get worse. We need parties. Unfortunately, the election laws in this country are so hostile to all but the 2 biggest parties that the system doesn't work right. So open primaries used to mean a system in which there's no voter registration and any person can come to the polls on primary day and choose any party's primary. That is the classic definition of open primary. But the people who are hostile to parties have kidnapped the term, causing great confusion. And they want people to think open primaries means a system where parties don't even have nominees anymore. So it depends. You have to define open primary, but if you mean a system where parties don't have nominees anymore, it's a bad idea. And there's a group in New York City that's very well funded, and they are trying as hard as they can to get the system where parties don't have nominees implemented all over the country.
This is the condition in which nominal democracy converges upon dictatorship. This is one of these things that people don't realize, right? That the reason that the United States is a republic and not a democracy is precisely because it's possible, because a lot of this, of course, has been attempted in Greece and was successful in Greece. you could elect or nominate and elect various combinations of people, but you were still coming out with various forms of dictatorship. And one of the reasons that this becomes an important thing to discuss, not in terms of the formalisms, but in terms of this idea of access. I mean, take this for a problem, right? You have an open primary, but I have no money. But there's no laws presently that stop, various people from spending if they want $100 million, okay? So one of the elements I think is important for us, and I have some other questions for people, is to think about, how in 2021, 2022, how do we want to address the present circumstance so that we get something like equity in the elections? Now, we realize, of course, there's legal sides to that. There's all kinds of things that may have to be done. But how would you even begin to address this present circumstance and change it? I mean, we heard about proportional representation already, but is there anything that people think should be discussed? And Dion, if you want to jump in here, we haven't heard from you. So if you've got
I want to make sure, like Barack Obama said, I know what I'm talking about. So I'll start with your question and go back to Diane. What we need is campaign finance reform in the sense that every candidate that makes the ballot should be able to participate in the debate. And that's a problem. Everybody's talking about getting big money out, but it has to be followed by example where campaign finance and most of the media give every candidate equal and opportune time to be in a debate publicly, because some of those campaign finance funds go to those debates as well. But I want to circle back to something that you guys said earlier, which is open primaries. One of the things that I found interesting that needs to be talked about civically across the board is the phenomenon of Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat nor Republican, yet he signed a pledge in order to be in a Democrat primary. So that was kind of strange to me last year, because everybody was like, oh my God, Bernie Sanders is a Democrat. And I was like, no, Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat, registered Democrat at all. So that's something I believe a lot of candidates, or in order to have open primaries, they should have some kind of disclosure form that third-party candidates can sign on to a big major party in order to participate in their primaries, because I don't think that was very fair what Bernie Sanders was able to do.
Well, I actually, this thing about the parties, I hadn't thought of it in that way before, in the way that Richard is saying it, because it seems to me what I've seen from the parties is just horrible. I actually think there's one whole other part of the government that has been dysfunctional, which Ben Franklin warned about, which is the people. I think the population has a very low standard of what they put up with, and they don't demand certain things that they should demand in a republic. So they like people have this mistaken belief running a government is just like running a business. Well, no, it's not. The government of the United States has the power, for example, to issue credit, and credit that, as Hamilton said, a debt which can extinguish itself. So you want it to go into certain things, but having a certain debt for a capital fund for internal improvements is not like your personal business, or maybe it is, but it's certainly not like your household budget exactly. So there's a difference. Similarly, people really, since the cultural paradigm shift of the 60s, have become smaller, self-absorbed. We have a culture, if you think of Ayn Rand writing this book, The Virtue of Selfishness, if you do something for someone else that you're making a sacrifice, well, you're just a chump. Why are you wasting your time? You shouldn't do that. Everyone knows no one would do that. There must be something in it for them. So we have this cynical kind of attitude. And then people like political figures that are equally corrupt as they themselves are. So they're not demanding what should be demanded of their leaders. And if we're gonna have that kind of culture, then I'm not sure there's any system that would allow us to elect leaders who would be qualified to govern. Now, you might say, well, how do you solve that problem? That's, but I think we can't ignore that. And I am not actually sold on this question of parties per se, unless we have parties that are committed to constitutional principles and not by money. Now, maybe campaign finance reform is one way to go to sort of control how much money gets sloshed around in these things. But that, and then the other thing I want to say is, I mean it, the debates, you know, in the Lincoln Douglas debates, which I guess were for legislature, but I understand that in those debates, each candidate had something like 45 minutes for their opening statement. And I don't know how long, and they went on for 3 hours or 4 hours. And candidates were expected to say things of substance, and the population was expected to have an attention span to, I'm sorry about this dog, he's going deaf and it makes him bark a lot. At any rate, but the people had an attention span to listen to that. So, yeah, I'm not sure that whether we have parties or don't have parties or open primaries or not can actually solve this. And maybe the finance reform is the best way to kind of lay down some laws that at least limit the obscenity of it all. But I don't know. What do people think?
Well, may I interject here?
Sure.
When in 1992, when Bush and Clinton was sparring, Bush for his second term and Clinton, the new guy on the block, and Perot entered the race, and they had a debate, the three of them. That was the last time I remember that the top candidates debated in with more than the Democrat and the Republican, and Perot was the independent. And Perot had charisma. And he said, you know, you hear the giant sucking motion of the jobs leaving this country. Well, what are you guys going to do about that? I'll tell you what I'm going to do. And he was ahead in the California primary. At that time in 92, he was ahead of both Bush and Clinton. So what happened was Bush got his boys in the CIA, and this is what I suspect, to threaten his family. And he pulled out and was presented in the captive media as a flake. He still, you know, he dropped out and then he came back in again, and he still got 19% of the vote because Bush and Clinton were horrible, and they are horrible. And historically, they'll be judged as being horrible. And Clinton hadn't even been in the presidency. And if it wasn't for Perot, it's possible that Bush would have gotten his second term. So yes, an open debate, being shut out of the debates. When I'm in a debate with these characters, I wipe the floor with them. You know, they have there's no substance. I said, I have a 10-second campaign speech. I believe in the 5-fingered exercise: full-time jobs with full benefits, free healthcare, free housing, not free housing, free healthcare, free education, low-cost housing, and a decent environment. Together, power to the people and respect for the environment. I think that took 10 seconds. All right? It's that simple. They're not, what are they talking, crime? Because the Post, every time somebody is killed, the Post puts that person on the front page. I mean, it's not going to work.
Well, they do. Sorry to cut you off, Anthony. They do a lot of emotional wordplay with people to get them to react. Or Diane, to your point, you know, Socrates never liked democracy, and if we go by your logic with the people, then basically the people with the most knowledge and experience should be able to take a test in order to engage a vote. One of the things that I do like, though, that might help with that is when they said they want to make a national day off or a holiday for when there's election, people to vote to be more engaged. And even in New York right now, we're still debating about automatic voter registration, even though a lot of people don't even know that 16 and 17-year-olds can actually pre-register to vote. And that's the kind of thing that people should be aware of, that even the Board of Elections doesn't do much outreach or the civic engagement of it, you know?
Can I briefly respond to that?
Sure.
Why Tuesday? To discourage people who work?
That's funny.
City University doesn't give the students the day off, but Columbia University does. And I can go on. Pick a Saturday or a Sunday.
Have a polling site on a college campus.
Well, you know, the 2004 election was won in Ohio with tampering of the voting machines, because the most reliable source of voting, and in many countries that is the case, is paper ballots. Paper ballots, not working the software behind the scenes. So,
Yeah, I think that just to say a couple more questions for people, I'm coming back to Robert for a minute, and but segueing on that, we know how to vote. We know how to vote in such a way that it's transparent. You don't need digital voting to vote. And also, obviously, if we are willing to have a country which at the level of factionalization we've reached, we intend to bring back together a day on which people all voted, which was a national holiday devoted to that, is a faster way to correct all of this. I think it is true that we want to very much encourage the idea of civic involvement. And some of us have done that. Some of us decided to devote our lives in various ways to that. And some of us believe or have believed that some form of alternate, you can call it a party, sometimes you can call it a candidate slate. You can talk about the idea of people running for office, inclusive of everyone in the United States that can become involved in that kind of process. In the days of the county committee offices, like you have in a state like New Jersey, for example, or also New York. You have all these small county committee offices. Nobody runs for them. And of course, these are generally party-based offices. There's something artificial about that, but there's also something very useful about the idea of, people being involved on the capillary level. But nobody's going to do that unless there's a focus of the entire nation on solving this problem and not solving it as a partisan question. Clearly, it's possible. And many of us, I think, Richard, you tell me if this is the case for you, that during the Nixon period and in the aftermath of Watergate in particular, 1976's election, for example, saw a lot of people running. I first was involved in 73 in running for office when I was 20 years old. I was city council in Newark, and I wasn't even old enough to vote for myself until the election would have happened. But we got involved, and the purpose of that election, in my view, when I ran, was to try to find people who agreed with what we were saying. I ran as a U.S. Labor Party independent candidate for city council in Newark. And my concept was, hey, I don't know how many people are going to vote for me. Maybe you get 200 or 300 or 500. I don't know. But I can probably find those voters because there's going to be so few of them. These are people that think the way I think. And that's worthwhile because now maybe we can identify people that agree with what we're saying, work together for this objective. And that's what's important. So sometimes, yes, getting elected, of course we want to get elected, but failing that. And this is why I think the crime around the thing with the petitioning is the biggest crime. It would be great to petition if that was a way that you were really meeting people and sort of, they get to know you and now you get on the ballot. So you don't make the thing too onerous for the candidates to get on. And the candidates that have no money or the candidates that have no recognition or the candidates that are completely new, right? Now they've got a way to engage. Now they are getting involved in the process. That's what it ought to be. So that's just my thing. I'd like to see how you guys, what your own view of that is.
I can tackle that because I'm actually a county committeeman here in the Bronx in the 79th district. One of 3 people actually did their petitions in their building throughout their block. Dion has something called repmyblock.com where everybody can run the county committee. There's actually 1,200 vacancies in the Bronx and, a couple of 100,000, not 100,000, but thousands more in New York City. And that's very important because we are the pro bono elected officials that are supposed to be the bottom of the pyramid to circulate information and resources up to the paid people and that down. Of course, there's district leaders, state committee, and judicial delegates, and so forth. But to your point, there needs to be election reform because a lot of people in charge of the board of elections are political appointees from both parties, right? But then my argument this year with the Conservative Party chairman was like, well, why can't the third parties have people that are appointed and paid to work at the board of elections? Because like with Larry Sharp in 2018, a lot of board of elections didn't even have them on the ballot. The case in point was because the contract of the printer, and there's different counties in the state, they were so civically disengaged, they only put the same normal party of people there. So there was a whole bunch of hiccups. And we all know, whoever ran for office here, especially you, Anthony, here in the city, that there's a lot of shenanigans, of course, that go on the board of elections that needs to be brought to light. So I'll just turn the mic over to you.
That's for sure. I mean, I don't think we even know the half of it, but when I saw that what's his face, I shouldn't call him what's his face, but Mr. Benjamin was involved in that company that was doing 500% loans, and he's now supposedly disinvested. At any rate, it's I'm still not sold on the idea that we have to have parties. I was thinking about what George Washington was getting at, to my mind, is that if you end up in a competition among the parties, or you're saying, well, I want to do what's best for my party, that you're increasing the divisiveness amongst the population. And who is going to have it? Will people lose the mission of what is actually best for the nation? What is actually best for everybody as a whole? Or at any rate, it seems to me that getting rid of parties doesn't necessarily mean you would end up in a catastrophically, horribly governed nation, as long as we still had a republic. I mean, after all, you are electing people to represent you, or you have a representative form of government. It's not a pure democracy, and our president has a certain amount of power, which I think is as it should be. I think it would be very dangerous to have a parliamentary system where you could just have a vote of no confidence and the person be thrown out, sort of like what we just saw with Cuomo, which I think, as much as I may disagree with many of his policies, I think it is very dangerous when you can just eliminate people who were elected based on scandal or whatever.
Well, that belongs to the legislature, which has the power of impeachment.
Right.
Well, that's the key. We have that was built in.
Right, not to be bullied.
What?
I said not to be bullied or pressured by the media and big pharma, because you won't mandate the vaccine.
Exactly.
I'd like to say something about George Washington.
Yes.
He condemned partisanship. He condemned the spirit of party.
Mm-hmm.
He himself was the leader of the Federalist Party.
Right.
And Thomas Jefferson was the leader of the Democratic Republican Party. But Washington was inclusive, and he made sure to have leaders of both parties in his cabinet. That's the proper way for parties to exist. But the big difference between the two parties under the Washington administration was foreign policy. George Washington loathed the French Revolution. He loathed it so much, when the ambassador from the French Revolution came to call on him, George Washington made sure to have a portrait of the beheaded Louis XVI hanging on the wall, just to know what he. So the trouble, the United States ruined parties 100 years ago when we forced them to nominate in primaries. There's no other country in the world where the government takes over the role of holding a government administered primary for parties to nominate. It works so much better in the rest of the world. The parties can choose the best people for office, and those people don't have to work so hard to get to run in the primary. There are a lot of very good people who would serve, except it's so much work to run for office. And so I think if we had the 19th century parties where the party leaders picked the people, the party system would work a lot better, and it wouldn't be so partisan. I can't prove that, but why are we the only country in the world that has government administered primaries for parties to pick nominees? Shouldn't we at least think about that?
But one thing you got to add to it is special elections. In New York State, well, at least in the Bronx, special elections are kind of peculiar because now you have only limited time to petitions, but the two major parties, or a party for that matter, they can actually have a county committee meeting and appoint who will have that party line automatically. Now, the special elections were open where everybody had to do petitions. They actually do that in city council. We have to make up your party. That actually works a little bit more differently. People actually have to work a little bit harder to get that message out.
Could I bring up a couple points here?
Sure.
And I don't want to get too far off topic, but triggering in my mind from some of this discussion is the concepts of Dillon's rule and home rule. We've been bringing up the idea of republic and trying to get people more engaged and maybe give more local control and options. But, many states, and Richard Ringer would know the data on this better than me, but many states in the US use the Dillon's rule concept where the county governments are essentially arms of the state government. They have limited local power. They execute what the state government applies. And then you have states that with more of a home rule concept where, except for limited things, and those are more, that's extending the republic concept from federal to state, now down to county, where the county has quite a bit of local power and say in what they do, instead of being so much dictated by the state. Fortunately, in New York, we have the situation perversion where you have unfunded mandates where the state says, okay, you have to do this. We're not going to give you the money to do it either. So, and then the flow back of Medicaid. But again, don't want to get too far off topic. We do some weird things in New York, but I think expanding the use of home rule in every state in the US would be an improvement in our government too. I would like to see that more done in New York, more pushback from the county governments. And then I'm speaking again from a rural point of view in an opposite direction. I have a county of 50,000 residents, 9 towns and a village, and some of these small upstate counties, I have to question the efficiency of having all these little town and village governments. We have towns and villages of just a few hundred people, and we're electing, 5 or 10 board positions, costing hundreds of thousands or maybe even over $1 million. And that's got to be supported by, a tax base of a few hundred people. Now you do the math, it seems like people are paying taxes just to pay salaries. And I think this feeds into the patronage and political corruption problem, is that you're just creating all these positions, elected positions that aren't all that necessary perhaps. So maybe that's part of the problem too. I mean, we're kind of brainstorming about a lot of different difficulties, but I think home rule would be a help. And I think maybe consolidation of some of these government entities that are just really too small to be effective and efficient, to get away from the patronage problem. Because I think the patronage problem can actually start at the local level in small towns and villages and fiefdoms, and some of those people eventually, the crud of the crop, end up rising to the top and going for the higher level elected positions as they're in office longer, and that's how we end up with people in power, in the state and federal government that started with poor roots in the local government. So anyway, that's my little stump speech about improving local government also.
I have a question that might apply for everybody. How does everybody feel about the matching funds program that we have here in New York City expanding statewide? Because that might affect all of us, where right now it went up from 6 to 1 to 8 to 1, putting more money from the taxpayers into campaigns across the board.
There aren't federal matching funds for House and Senate races. They have had that for presidential races. So I would personally love matching funds, but I actually think that there should be a limit to how much people are allowed to spend on elections. I think there should be a limit because it's really unfair. They are bought in a way right now. And I think, perhaps reflecting on what Richard has been saying about the necessity of having parties, maybe, did he fall off or is he still there? I can't see him anymore.
He had to sign out.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. All right. Yes. All right. Then, the system itself may not be so bad. It's possible there would be a candidate, myself for the moment, that doesn't fit in with any of the parties who would run. But if you give people either who are nominated by their parties or candidates who qualify equal time in the debates, equal press, equal access to the voters, because we definitely have a system that has been hijacked by Wall Street and by the big money. And if you're not part of that or beholden to that, you seem somehow to not have any voice or any visibility.
If you make the ballot, you should be in every poll. I think that should be a simple change in election law to say that any agency that's being paid to do polls should be listing every candidate that's fought the difficult effort to get on the ballot.
Absolutely. Absolutely correct. I was going to say, when you were talking about you're in the rural area, I mean, it's worth reading James Fenimore Cooper's American Democracy, where he talked about the town meetings where people would get together and decide whether they're going to vote for road building or dealing with the chickens in the road. They would get together. It was American democracy. And it worked on a local level in upstate New York. And Cooper was writing about this. Before that, you have Washington Irving, who pokes fun at Jefferson and Salmagundi. And he invents a politician who, when he was principled, he got nowhere. But when he became unprincipled, and he makes this, he calls this guy Timothy Dabble. As soon as he made himself a useful fellow to the bosses, he rose and became a great little man. It's a wonderful passage in Washington Irving, and that was in like 1807. And before he died, the Whigs tried to run him for mayor of New York in 1850. But yeah, our great authors had a lot of interesting things to say, which would strike a resonant chord with some of the things that you've been saying, Rich.
Yeah, I think Americans used to like each other.
Well, there's always the race issue. The race issue, forget it. When it came to the Native Americans, the genuine Native Americans and African Americans, they didn't like them, these white people. So that's obviously has come to the front in the George Floyd demonstrations, where 15 to 25 million people were in the street, most of them young, 61% white, 39% black and brown. And that has to be discussed because it's not getting any better, the relations between the races, given Trump's record on that.
I'm surprised one of the things that we didn't talk about that kind of unites the whole spectrum between far left and far right is term limits. If we had more term limits, then there would be more candidates, vying for office and getting, this messaging out there. That's one thing I found.
Well, yeah, you have more chance of dying in office than you have of being turned out of office in the state legislature. Isn't that the old saw?
That's right.
Resigning for corruption.
Well, look at Erastus Corning, the mayor of Albany. What was he there? 45 years he was mayor? Something like that.
Yeah, Schumer has been in Washington for 42 years as of 2022. It's pretty.
Well, he never met a camera he didn't like.
Who hasn't?
Well, no. And my first introduction to Schumer is when he attended Roy Cohn's 50th birthday party in 1980 at Studio 54.
Wow, it's going back.
Did you actually meet him?
That's Schumer.
Yeah. Did you actually meet him, or you just know about it?
Did I meet who?
Schumer.
Well, I was faculty advisor to student government at Borough Manhattan Community College for 10 years. And before the administration purged the faculty members. But I used to go up to Albany when we had the candidates night or whatever it was, the Black caucus meeting, Black and Latino caucus would meet up in Albany on
That's right.
birthday. And there would be Chuck, and I'd take the student president and say, here's Senator from New York, shake hands. So yeah. I did that in that context.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that the City College of New York is actually the first student government in America. And that's how I got started. If there were more student governments throughout the educational system and with the civics component of bridging the gap, like Caucus Weekend in Albany or Professional Grad Caucus or Somos, I think that'd be pretty cool.
We did get a question in the chat here. which, or as a comment actually, aren't term limits a way for people to escape the responsibility of paying attention to their government and its actions? What do
See,
people
actually,
think about that?
I think if we controlled the money, if we limited the money,
You would
that-
have people not with term limits, would you?
exactly, people would be out. Part of the way they stay in there so long is because of the money.
The longer they're in, the more corrupt they become.
Yeah,
And complacent.
Well, yeah, definitely.
owned.
Look at Charlie Rangel, when he was handling Harlem when Hillary was running against Obama back in 2008 in the primaries. There were certain precincts in Harlem where Obama didn't get a single vote. I mean, come on. He
Yeah,
ran the
man.
entire Harlem machine.
That's right. And the district
Not that I'm a
leaders,
partisan of either of these, any of these people, but the point is it was totally corrupt.
yeah, like the district leaders, for example, here in New York City, that actually appoint and control strategically where the poll workers go at different polling sites. So there's a lot of, shenanigans, like I said earlier.
Yeah.
Well, I think we should be wrapping up, but I'd like to ask everyone one at a time if there's something that you want to make sure that you got out. So maybe Dion, why don't you go first?
Oh, sorry. Yes. What I wanted to say was this, that the Black vote, quote unquote, has been taken advantage of. So one of the things I'm doing, because I'm all about doing something for change, I'm actually the director of outreach and partnerships for Blexit, which is Black Exit, We the Free. We are changing the narrative for African Americans here in the country, no matter what you feel about our founder. But yes, we are promoting, things that we hope will make the African American community wake up and not be controlled or manipulated, feel obligated to vote for one party. And that's why I want everybody to, because you don't have to join our organization, but I'm just putting that out there as, that's going on, that should actually work. Because African Americans last cycle with Trump and Biden, actually African American men didn't really vote as much as they used to for the Democratic Party.
Great, thanks. Rich?
Just to reiterate my point of before, I think let's prioritize a fight I think we can best win. I think getting the signature count cut back is a difficult battle. I think we should make the fight of getting the petition period back to summer and try to get it from 6 weeks up to 12. So that would double the time. We'd have triple the signatures, but double the time. So that's not, that'll cut the burden a bit. And I also didn't point this out before, but a July, August petition period, as it used to be, would be after the June primary. So I think we have to discuss and recommend a sore loser exclusion. So the people that lose the June primary cannot take advantage of the independent period to try to get on the ballot as an independent when they really just tried to run as a major party candidate. So we don't want the major party people, using this as an opportunity to really tank the opportunity for true independence. So I really think that's a battle we can better fight and win to get the period moved back to summer versus trying to get the signatures cut back, at least in the short term. So thank you for having me on this evening.
Thank you so much for joining. Professor?
Yeah, well, I endorse everything that Rich said. And I also think, well, he also said this earlier, that all the candidates should be listed who are eligible to be elected and not just focus on the main candidates, and then all the candidates who are eligible should be involved in the debates. What struck me about Winger's presentation, he said, there are so many parties and 9 of the 10 best governed countries have proportional representation. All the parties are represented within the election. And then they divvy up the vote in the legislature, the parliament. So yes, I think that would be, and of course, take the money out of election. Citizen United really did a tremendous damage to politics with the money issue.
Yep, I agree. Dennis?
Well, I have something. I don't know if you can see it. Is that able to be seen? Can people see those headlines or not? Does that work?
I can see it, yeah.
Okay, that says there, Boyd confronts Warhawk Moynihan, wins an ovation at Harlem Forum. And what it shows is my friend Zeke Boyd, who ran at that time for US Senate against Patrick Moynihan in New York in 1976. He was running for the US Labor Party. And what happened was, up in Harlem, the Committee of 100 Black Men insisted that because he was a legitimate candidate for office, Moynihan had to appear with him. Now, that is impossible in today's New York City because Zeke was running as a third-party candidate. He would never have been in a debate with Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was at that time very well known in the United States as the proponent of what was called benign neglect. He became famous for that in 1969. So when you talked about the problems of the cities and the problems of the cutbacks in education and hospital and healthcare and so on in the Black communities and the urban removal, Daniel Patrick Moynihan was the signature of that. He never would have been on a today confronting a candidate like Zeke Boyd. That's what's actually happened to the system. I think what we have to do is we have to reverse this process. And what a lot of what's going on right now in the country is a subterfuge for actually destroying the possibilities. Yeah, anybody can vote, but you can't run. So the way you get it is you got a kind of a Politburo, a kind of, potheads Politburo, which is running basically the control of elections at the top. And then claiming, well, it doesn't matter. We'll let you vote in any way you want. You can register the same day. You can see we're really, but you control for whom people can vote. So I just think that it's very important for us to be in this battle, see it all the way through. Tomorrow, Diane and I will be doing a forum also, or speaking also on Saturday in something different. It won't be addressing this matter, but it will be addressing some of the policy implications of this sort of thing happening in the country. So people are interested in that. So that's tomorrow at 2 o'clock. And you can find out more just by consulting both the LaRouche organization or the Schiller Institute site. But just in terms of the issue that we just posed, I just wanted to make that point.
Great, thanks. Well, first, I really want to thank everyone for participating, and also Richard Winger, who's no longer with us. I think everyone's participation demonstrates that, contrary to what you see in the media and what we see from our main, quote unquote, mainstream Democratic and Republican candidates, there is actually an enormous amount of goodwill in the nation. And I think that we don't have a lot of time, because the very real means of physical existence in this country are in jeopardy as long as we continue this kind of bailout policy. They are using the billionaires club, as I said, scarcity. If you constrict the flow of energy, you are jeopardizing people's lives. And if you further shut down agriculture, as we are doing in this country very rapidly, you are cutting very vital means of human existence. So the things that people have taken for granted up to this point, you may discover suddenly don't exist in the way that you've been accustomed to. And therefore, I think it's incumbent upon us to figure out a way to break through this. And I actually think that the majority of the population wishes to survive, wishes that their children would have a future where their lives and their standard of living could be better than their own. That used to be, I think, in a very real way, the American dream, that people would work hard, that people would come here. And your idea was that your children would have an easier life than you did, and they would become better educated, live longer, and be more productive. So to do that, we're going to have to come together, and we're going to have to put an end to this dictatorship of the banks. And I think that the fact that we've been able to come together in this program indicates that this is possible. I think there's a real desire to do this on the part of the American people. And I hope that we can continue this. So again, thank you very, very much for being here. And we will continue this discussion in one form or another, I'm sure.
Thank you, Diane, for inviting me.
Thank you, Diane. This is fun.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Diane.